Ever since the arrival of Hugo Chavez over 20 years ago, the US government has constantly tried to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution. The anti-Chavista opposition groups have never stopped getting instructions and money from Washington, and they've also relied on the propaganda support of the corporate media. Therefore, we ask, what are the pillars that sustain such a favorable media narrative? Let's take a look at 5 myths about the Venezuelan opposition. Myth number 1. The Venezuelan opposition is peaceful. The mainstream media always makes a point of including the peaceful adjective when describing any initiative by the anti-Chavista opposition. The goal is to establish the premise that any response to these activities is thus violent and repressive. Nevertheless, over the past 20 years, the opposition has shown time and again its willingness to resort to violence in its attempts to take back power.
Llegó el momento de volver a empezar a calentar la calle.
The 2002 coup. After the Chavez government implemented a set of wide-reaching laws to deepen the Bolivarian process, the Venezuelan elites generated a civilian military uprising that overthrew the government, kidnapped Chavez, and did away with all public powers. But a massive popular mobilization with military allies restored Chavez and constitutional order in less than 48 hours. 2013 to 2017, Guarimbas. Opposition shock groups unleashed multiple waves of violence on a national scale, resulting in hundreds of deaths among members of security forces, government supporters, opposition supporters, and simple bystanders.
O esto cambia, o esto revienta.
2019, the Battle of the Bridges. Following the self-proclamation of Juan Guaidó, several opposition leaders openly called for a U.S. military intervention, while the opposition-controlled National Assembly subscribed to the Rio Military Treaty. The closest that this intervention came to pass was the so-called Battle of the Bridges, an event in which the Venezuelan opposition, alongside foreign forces, tried to force quote-unquote humanitarian aid across closed borders with Brazil and Colombia, resulting in violent clashes between the National Guard and paramilitary forces.
Y la ayuda humanitaria entra sí o sí.
Myth number 2. The Venezuelan opposition is democratic. Another common label thrown on the Venezuelan opposition is that it's democratic. This is an extension of American exceptionalism and the propaganda that sustains U.S. foreign policy. All of Washington's actions, and those of its Venezuelan allies, are presented as being in defense of democracy, and thus their promoters are democratic. However, with over 25 electoral contests being held since 1998, the Venezuelan opposition has consistently opted for boycotts, fraud allegations, and sabotage against Venezuelan institutions and democratic rules. 2013, presidential elections. The first contest after the passing of Hugo Chavez resulted in a narrow victory for Chavista candidate Nicolás Maduro over his opposition rival, Enrique Capriles. The Venezuelan opposition, with U.S. support, resorted to several strategies to try to discredit the result. This attitude set off the most violent stage in the country's recent history, the so-called Guarimbas, which were used as a paramilitary pressure method. The starting point was Capriles' call for his supporters to, quote-unquote, unleash their anger.
Descargue toda esa rechera.
2015, National Assembly elections. After winning the legislative elections, the opposition looked to use parliament as a springboard to overthrow the Maduro government. The opposition leadership tried to come up with an impeachment process, tried to retroactively shorten the presidential mandate, as well as to start rumors questioning Maduro's Venezuelan nationality. All in all, a bag of unconstitutional tricks outside the National Assembly's mandate. 2018, presidential elections. Following the pattern in recent Venezuelan elections, the main opposition sectors decided not to take part in the 2018 presidential race. With the help of the international media, they proclaimed beforehand that the elections would be fraudulent. This strategy laid the groundwork for Juan Guaidó's illegal self-proclamation as interim president months later, and for the escalation of U.S. sanctions. Myth number 3. The Venezuelan opposition is honest. The Venezuelan right wing has a long-standing reputation of corruption and discredit. The 40-year pact before Chavez, known as Punto Fijismo, made it clear that honesty is not one of its traits. Many of those who were leaders then remain at the helm of the opposition nowadays. Fast forward to the present, and in mere months, the self-proclaimed Guaidó, quote-unquote, administration made its dishonest credentials clear. 2019, Humanitarian Aid Fund. One of the largest scandals engulfing the opposition in 2019 had to do with the money raised in Colombia for supposed humanitarian aid in February. pro-opposition media outlets themselves revealed that Guaido's envoys had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in luxury hotels and restaurants, high-end retail shops, traveling, and other extravagant habits such as hiring escorts. 2019, alliance with Los Rastrojos paramilitary. Weeks after the Battle of the Bridges, Colombian NGO Progresar revealed that opposition leader Guaido had crossed the Venezuelan-Colombian border thanks to paramilitary outfit Los Rastrojos. The leaked photos showed the kind of company that Venezuela's self-proclaimed president keeps in Colombia, and who he relied upon for his humanitarian aid circus. Colombia's President Iván Duque and Chile's Sebastián Piñera were also caught in the scandal. 2019 and 2020. Venezuelan assets.
Casa Blanca ha ordenado congelar todos los activos de Venezuela.
The recognition of Guaido by countries such as the US and Colombia allowed the opposition to take control of Venezuelan assets abroad, such as US-based oil subsidiary Citgo. Calderón Bertí, formerly Guaido's representative in Colombia, was the one to denounce that the people chosen by the opposition to take charge of Monomeros de Venezuela, a Colombian subsidiary of Venezuela's petrochemical firm Pequiven, were destroying the company with their corrupt practices. Myth number 4. The Venezuelan opposition is autonomous. While the mainstream media bends over backwards to present an opposition with its own agenda and representing the majority of Venezuelans, facts paint a different picture. Throughout all the years of the Bolivarian Revolution, the United States government, alongside regional allies such as Colombia, Chile, Brazil, and Peru, has openly confessed to leading plans to overthrow the Venezuelan government. 2014 to 2020, sanctions against Venezuela. The best example of the umbilical cord tying the main opposition groups to Washington are the sanctions imposed against the Caribbean nation, going back to 2014 and the Obama administration. In 2019 alone, the U.S. Treasury Department imposed an oil embargo, targeted the subsidized food program CLAP, and later imposed a blanket ban against the country. All of it with the endorsement of Venezuelan opposition leaders.
But we really haven't done the really tough sanctions yet. We can do the tough sanctions, and all options are open. 2017
to 2020, foreign funding. The fact that the anti-Chavista agenda is set in Washington is very much related to U.S. agencies being the main source of funding for opposition parties and NGOs. According to USAID itself, the Venezuelan opposition has received $467 million since 2017.
We want to thank Trump administration, the president, the vice president, for their commitment in favor of our fight to restore democracy in Venezuela.
2019 to 2020, trips to Washington. Opposition leaders have been pictured alongside U.S. officials time and again in recent months. In key moments, such as Guaido's self-proclamation, it was revealed that it was a phone call from U.S. Vice President Mike Pence which green-lighted the plan. Another symbolic example was Guaido's visit to the White House on February 5th of 2020. He was received by Trump himself, and renewed attacks against the Venezuelan government soon followed. Myth number 5. The Venezuelan opposition is united. The final myth about the Venezuelan opposition pushed by the corporate media has to do with its apparent unity. Though on some occasions the main opposition forces managed to present a united front against Chavismo, it is just as true that in key moments they have been split by infighting. 2019, National Dialogue Table. An opposition sector broke ranks in mid-2019, denouncing something that was obvious to everyone. Sanctions were hurting the Venezuelan people. This moderate sector opened a dialogue process with the government to go back to the political game via the constitutional channels. 2020, parliamentary split. Another opposition faction challenged Guaido's leadership, with serious corruption accusations thrown from both sides. This split meant that the US-backed opposition sectors lost control of the National Assembly in January, with Guaido replaced as head of parliament. In response, he followed a familiar script. He set up a parallel parliament that retained support from the US and the other usual suspects. 2020, parliamentary elections. Another split in the fraught Venezuelan opposition can be seen on the horizon. The US has already announced that it will not recognize the upcoming legislative elections, while some leaders stress that they will not take part until the Maduro government is removed. Nevertheless, more mainstream Venezuelan opposition parties, such as Acción Democrática, have announced that they will participate. To sum up, the Venezuelan opposition in recent times has revealed itself as being violent, non-democratic, corrupt, compliant, mistake-prone, ridden with divisions, and with no prospects of fixing these maladies anytime soon. The recent failed paramilitary coup attempt featuring US mercenaries put all of these qualities on display. Luckily for opposition leaders, they can rely on major corporate media outlets, always willing to build the myths that sustain them.